Just speak up.
Okay.
So this presentation is not going to be an exhaustive review of all the work that I've made over the course of the thesis year, because that will be better assessed in the final review in a few weeks' time. Instead, I'm going to take this opportunity to try to lay out my current line of thinking and approach, and will show work that helps tell the deeper story of my thesis inquiry. As you may recall, my thesis was previously called thaumazin, an ancient Greek word meaning wonder. The Greeks understood this word thaumazin, or wonder, to be the root of all inquiry. Wonder for them was a kind of gateway. You passed through it from the normal state of mundane day-to-day existence, which we're all familiar with, to a state in which insight flows and discoveries become possible. It's not a bad title, but it requires too much description or else risks being meaningless. So now I'm simply calling my thesis Turn On, a gloss on Timothy Leary's Turn On, Tune In, and a way of quickly suggesting the two states the ancient Greeks perceived, which are the normal status quo we occupy most of the time, versus a heightened state which enables insight. My thesis explores whether design may serve as a gateway between these two states. It may seem strange to have the words mechanics and wonder next to each other in my subtitle. Wonder isn't mechanical. Yet as I got deeper into my thesis inquiry, I became fascinated by aspects of semiotics, cognitive science, social theory, anthropology, animism, Buddhism, conceptual art, improvisation, phenomenology, and other related areas, all of which touch on this issue of wonder. Some of you may have seen an example of the importance of wonder in learning on NPR last week. These were a series of experiments in which babies were shown magic tricks which seemed to defy the laws of physics and logic. And these animated GIFs are taken from the NPR website. When presented with a range of toys to play with, babies universally chose the ones that had grabbed their attention by seeming to defy the laws of nature. That is, their sense of wonder led to a deeper inquiry into the nature of those objects. And, according to the scientists, they played with them in ways which indicated they were testing the properties of those toys. In this case, testing the way in which gravity should act on a toy truck by smashing it into a table. So, while not technically graphic design, these experiments hopefully demonstrate what I mean by turn on. Our deeper attention can be awakened by a sense of wonder. While perhaps stating the obvious, it is important to note that what is happening here is happening entirely in the baby's experience. The form, as we would call it in design, in this case the magic trick performed with a ball or train, is only a trigger for an experience in the baby's mind. It possesses no wonder of its own. i.e., without the baby watching it, the form on its own is banal. Likewise, to an adult, the trick is obvious, and so the form is uninteresting. And again, the form has no wonder of its own. This is to say that objects themselves do not have inherent properties. Properties are only assigned to objects by the human imagination upon encountering the object. It is these intersections that my thesis seeks to explore in graphic design, the opportunities in reconciling form and the human imagination. This is to claim the preeminence of critical contextuality, relationality, and semiosis in my design practice. The first set of work I'm going to show is problematic portfolio material. Instead of designing things, I choose to regard form merely as substrate and seek to design relationships between substrates and viewers so that perceptual objects existing in the mind of the viewer may come into being. In this example, a live goldfish swims in a Vitamix food blender, which is plugged in but currently turned off, but which could at any moment be turned on. In terms of the form itself, as an empirical object, all I have created is an aquarium. Yet most viewers create for themselves the perceptual object of dread and immediately implicitly assign it to the physical or empirical object. This raises a host of questions, from issues of authorship to studies in cognitive science on the nature of consciousness. If consciousness is all in the mind, as Descartes thought, then you have dualism, in which the perceiving mind is separate from the world it perceives. Recent science has argued, however, that consciousness is in fact embedded, embodied, extended, and inactive, i.e. non-dualist. We are, in fact, very much a part of the environment and our capacity to act and perceive within it, which is something non-dualist native peoples the world over have been trying to tell us for centuries. As Chief Seattle said in 1845, humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. Or, as American psychologist James Hillman says, we have rather lost this difference that most cultures, even tribal ones, know and live in terms of. Our distinctions are Cartesian, between outer tangible reality and inner states of mind, or between body and a fuzzy conglomerate of mind, psyche, and spirit. We have lost the third, middle position, which earlier in our tradition, and in others too, was the place of soul, a world of imagination, passion, fantasy, reflection, that is neither physical and material on the one hand, nor spiritual and abstract on the other, yet bound to them both. This last part adeptly defines what I've been exploring as a design practice. Neither physical and material on the one hand, nor spiritual and abstract on the other, yet bound to them both. What would a design practice that addresses this look like? Could we call it perhaps psychoaesthetics? As a side note, it is tempting to consider the potential ethical implications of such a practice. If designers were to shift to a psychoaesthetic, non-dualist approach, would culture perhaps begin to rejoin what David Bohm has called the implicate order? And if so, what might this mean for diseases of dualist disregard, such as global warming? In the context of an MFA thesis presentation, claims that graphic design can save the world perhaps sound inflated, megalomaniacal, the result of too little sleep for too long. Yet these kinds of claims are exactly what artist and writer Susie Gablick has long argued for, offering the possibility of a re-enchantment of the world when we cease to define ourselves as different and distinct from it. So what we're really talking about here are the ways in which objects, empirical, physical objects, become incorporated into different worldviews. A great example of this was in the news a week ago. Astronomers want to build a 30-meter-wide telescope in the dormant volcano on Hawaii's Big Island, which may sound like an odd place, but in fact its elevation and freedom from light pollution make it ideal. And this will allow them to look 13 billion light years back into time, into deep space, and see the dawn of the universe. This is what it's going to look like. The problem is the local people's god lives in this volcano, and it is the site of their ancestors and sacred to their way of life. And they are actually beginning to be arrested for protesting the building of this telescope. So, one volcano, two completely different worldviews claiming it as their own. Again, form is only ever substrate and catalyst for the creation of perceptual objects, and the interzone between form and the viewer could be labeled a prosthetic extension of thought and perception. D. Fox Harrell, Associate Professor of Digital Media at MIT, in his 2014 book Phantasmal Media, has called these different worldviews epistemic domains, a way of summarizing the collective beliefs, assumptions, cultural practices, and so on of a given community. I created a project to explore the way that different epistemic domains may coalesce around the same physical object, revealing something of the nature of each. This poster series presents various anti-Western views on Valentine's Day from around the world. I have not changed the text at all. I've simply given voice to views that belong to these people by making promotional posters for them. So the president of Hindu Mahasabha says, display of love in the entire Valentine's week is equivalent to not following Indian traditions. Anyone found displaying love on Facebook, Twitter, or WhatsApp will be caught hold of. The Indonesian Ulema Council says celebrations of Valentine's Day are opposed to Indonesian culture and religious norms. The Malaysian Islamic Development Department's social ceremonies such as Valentine's Day are a stepping stone towards greater social ills such as fraud, mental disorder caused by alcohol, abortion, and baby dumping, and other negative ills that can invite disaster and moral decay among youths. A Bangkok city official: if kids really love each other, it's better for them to go and free birds and fish or go to the temple. And my favorite, Japanese communist group who call themselves the Revolutionary Alliance of Men That Women Are Not Attracted To. The blood-soaked conspiracy of Valentine's Day, driven by the oppressive chocolate capitalists, has arrived once again. In order to create a brighter future, we call for solidarity among our unloved comrades so that we may demonstrate in resolute opposition to Valentine's Day and the romantic industrial complex. So, promotional posters, and yet the sheer act of my creating these promotional posters as a white middle-class Westerner in the context of an art school and using a visual language of typeface and typesetting trends more conventional to this environment, and for an audience of similar people, immediately problematizes the message. Visual languages always arise out of epistemic domains. By cross-dressing epistemic domains, I am able to reveal their perimeters and, in fact, to point to their existence, as when we are living inside an epistemic domain, we do not notice it as such, but simply regard it as normal reality. In this context, the repeating text, the vertical text, resist colonization of the mind, which I did take the liberty of adding a hashtag to, but which is otherwise taken verbatim from an Islamist source, takes on multiple deeper meanings. So in this way, psychoaesthetic design can be used critically for social and political commentary, while again raising questions of authorship and contextuality. Yet how does a thing even become a thing? How do you build a perceptual object? A title sequence I made for an imaginary film about Edward Snowden, called Freedom, attempts to create the perceptual object through fragmentation, sequencing, and provocative incompleteness. The viewer substantiates the details, leading to a far more vivid realization of the perceptual object than a more representational form could ever hope to convey. So, suggestion rather than representation. And in fact, in terms of representation, it is misleading, as fire has nothing to do with the NSA directly. This is where the semiotics come in, as there's something about the quality of fire, creeping, devastating, redacting, engulfing, and of the charred, almost apocalyptic aftermath it leaves that is emotionally evocative of the more abstract axis of paranoia and receding privacy we find ourselves in. A further aspect of wonder that has fascinated me has to do with identity. This may sound on the one hand quite existential, while on the other it is something that is, in this increasingly networked and virtualized digital era, something we ignore at our peril. Just as objects are dynamically constituted by our perception and agency, I am asking if we also, as perceiving agents, are similarly defined by relationality, perhaps to a deeper degree than we suspect. To give a simple example, this week millions of people are scheduling appointments at the Apple Store to help them decide which Apple Watch fits their personality the best. This aspirational wearable product, in a way perhaps more obvious than most, can be said to constitute a prosthetic extension of the wearer's sense of self. But to turn this around and make a slightly more radical claim, might we not also ask whether the emergent thing we call self in fact constitutes a prosthetic extension of the Apple Watch? Certainly, beyond the Western tradition, relational epistemologies such as animism and Buddhism do not distinguish an individual self as separate from that which is experienced. Noted anthropologist Marilyn Strathern has coined the term dividual as distinct from individual to refer to non-Western notions of personhood that are not biologically bounded and discrete. And while I do not envisage starting a graphic design practice in tribal Polynesia, my contention here is that when paradigms of ownership shift to things like subscription services, or paradigms of privacy become equated with permissions, our very concept of selfhood begins to feel like a dottery mechanical inheritance from an earlier time. Self is now better thought of not as God-given, but as a composite of prior relations. Several of my thesis projects address these questions of identity. I'll show just a couple. A series of panorama selfies seemed a promising paradox through which to approach this issue of selfhood and contextuality. Here I am in the studio, in my apartment, on the train coming back from a concert in Boston, in the Portfolio Cafe, in the Fleet Library, in a bathroom somewhere, and in IHOP. To foreground the crisis that radical contextual selfhood poses for a graphic designer, I created a Pantone swatch book that bears my RISD user ID shortened name C. Fulbro on the front and offers the RISD series. Which C. Fulbro would you like to use today? Beside exploring the issue of identity, this project draws attention to the fact that, from a more David Bohm-like holistic perspective, far more goes into a design project than color choices or other such purely formal considerations. The final project I'm going to show similarly explores some of these tensions of identity. Taking an iPad, which here serves as an index of late capitalist Western dualism, and overlaying it over depictions of the human form which hail from multiple different epistemic domains and attendant notions of selfhood, a rift between worlds is again revealed, and the stuttering and struggling of the yellow face detection rectangle becomes a symbol for the frenzied algorithm-driven archival and avatarization of identity in the network age. The effect works especially well with the Buddha figure. The historical person, of course, represents the transcendence of self, and the dead, textured, roughly sculpted hunk of wood here makes no claims to illusory realism, but somehow materially emphasizes the absence of self in this empirical artifact. Yet when the iPad comes into contact with this, it valiantly seeks to identify a self. Could we say, perhaps, that the iPad is constructing a perceptual object? As a mechanical mirror of our own cultural and biological perceptual tendencies, perhaps this faltering, searching, dancing yellow rectangle, so assured in its scientifically sharp definition, yet so bewildered in its constantly revising staccato assessments, may tell us something of the nature of our own ongoing experience of wonder. Thanks.